Hi and good afternoon, and welcome to the Proclamation 2019 webinar. I'm Carrie Ballas, Director of Digital Learning, and to get started we're going to look at the agenda that we'll go through today. After I'm through with a welcome, we're going to hand it off to Kelly Calloway, our Senior Director of Instructional Materials, and she'll talk to you about instructional materials in Texas. And from there, we will go to Shelley Ramos, our Senior Director of Curriculum for Standards and Student Supports. And she's going to talk to you about the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, the English Language Proficiency Standards, and the breakouts. Then we'll go back to Kelly to talk about Proclamation 2019. And then we'll move on to Amy Williams, our Director of Review and Adoption, who will talk about the components of Proclamation 2019. We will then hand it off to Debbie Gonzalez, who will talk to us about accessibility requirements. We'll hand it back to Amy for next steps, and then we'll end with Kelly and questions. Now, throughout the webinar, you'll be able to answer questions within the application itself. And for the small questions that we can handle quickly, we will reply back through the questions tool. But if there are questions that seem really big and that everyone's asking about, we'll save those for the end, and Kelly can address those to the large audience. And then, of course, if we run out of time and there are still many questions left to be answered, we will follow up with an FAQ. So don't worry about if you missed or feel like you need further explanation. We'll have several ways of getting information and answers back out to you. So with that, we are going to practice a little bit and find out who's with us in our audience. And we're going to do a little bit of poll questions for a moment. So the first question, have you ever participated in the Texas review and adoption process? So we will close that in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and let's see what our audience said. So it looks like we're pretty close to having an evenly split audience. A lot of you have participated, but we have a large group who have not. Let's move on to the next question. And the second question, have you participated in the review and adoption process since the establishment of the instructional materials allotment, what we call the IMA? And we'll close in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Oh, wow, an even larger group. This will be the first time since the IMA has been established, and we do have a few of you veterans out there who know this process. So lots to learn today, and we're looking forward to talking with you and sharing information and, of course, answering questions as we go. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to hand this off to Kelly Calloway, our Senior Director of Instructional Materials, and let her explain to you about the instructional materials in Texas. So Tammy, if you will go ahead and bring up Kelly's screen, we'll get going.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm going to assume that everybody can see the right view here unless one of my colleagues tells me otherwise. So hopefully you can see my screen with an introduction to instructional materials in Texas. I had a little bit of a hunch that that last question would come back like it did, that many of you, well, most of you, have not participated in a Texas review and adoption set that includes the instructional materials allotment. So we're going to start off today talking a little bit about the big picture, how instructional materials are funded in Texas. And so that's, of course, directly related to that instructional materials allotment that Carrie's second poll question was about. How are instructional materials funds spent in Texas we're going to talk about for a little bit. We're going to talk about why state adoption is important, this process that we are embarking on with this webinar, and what that adoption process involves. So this is just kind of a big picture of the state of instructional materials in the state of Texas. First, we'll start with how they're funded. We're going to talk about 4 funds: the Permanent School Fund, and the Available School Fund, and the Instructional Materials Fund, and finally the Instructional Materials Allotment. These circles that you see here, these 3, are pretty much in size relation to each other. They're pretty much proportional. This big one, though, is not even vaguely proportional. Imagine this big blue circle just expanding and bursting off your screen and probably taking up the whole room in which you're sitting. The Permanent School Fund was created in the Constitution. It is a huge fund that is the largest educational fund in the world. We are very, very lucky to have that fund. It is what gives birth to, if you will, the Available School Fund. The Available School Fund is established from a payout of the Permanent School Fund at a rate that is determined biennially by the SBOE. So the SBOE establishes a rate for the payout creates the Available School Fund. To establish that rate, it considers all kinds of factors: the current value of the Permanent School Fund, the upcoming instructional materials needs, what are districts going to need for next biennium's instructional materials, and possibly most importantly, the maintenance of intergenerational equity in order to ensure that we don't spend so much on instructional materials for current students that we don't have enough for instructional materials for students 10 years down the road. The rate for this upcoming biennium, which will begin September 1st, is 3.7%. Traditionally, the Available School Fund is then split in half, and half of it goes to the Foundation School Program, which pays general education costs, and half of it goes to the Instructional Materials Fund. That's traditionally. Any Texas legislature can change that. They could change it so that instructional materials are funded with less than 50% of the Available School Fund. They could appropriate the money in such a way that instructional materials are funded with more than half of the Available School Fund. And so that's something that we are all at this point in the Texas legislative session watching very, very carefully. The Instructional Materials Fund, whether it's half, whether it's 40%, whether it's whatever percent of the available instructional materials, the Available School Fund, the Instructional Materials Fund funds everything related to instructional materials. It also funds special projects established by the legislature, and most importantly and most entirely, it funds the IMA. The IMA, then, is what we want to spend a little extra time on. The IMA was established as an annual allocation by Senate Bill 6 in the 82nd Texas legislature. That occurred in 2011. Prior to that time, the state owned all instructional materials. Since that time, districts get money from us, and they spend that money on instructional materials. It's now a biennial allotment, so districts only get those funds once every 2 years. They will get funded September 1st with whatever their fair share of the IMA is for that biennium. The instructional materials allotment pays for freight. No, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. The Instructional Materials Fund pays for freight. It pays for instructional materials for JJAEP, instructional materials for the Wyndham School District. The special projects that I mentioned this biennium that we're on the closing end of included on-track lessons and open source instructional materials. What's left after those things are taken out of the instructional materials fund is the instructional materials allotment. Typically, the instructional materials allotment is about 98% of the instructional materials fund. So whatever we get for the instructional materials fund from this legislative session, almost all of that, a huge percentage of that, will go toward the instructional materials allotment. The instructional materials allotment for this biennium that we're closing out right now was $196.91 per student, with an additional $19.55 per bilingual student. Because of the current value of the permanent school fund and the 3.7 payout rate, which is a little higher than the payout rate was last biennium, it is possible that the per student IMA could be higher this year. But remember that we don't have any guarantee that the legislature will fund it as half of the available school fund as they've done in the past. So we can't guarantee that. We won't know until after the legislative session closes and we know the exact amount that's appropriated for the instructional materials fund. So at that time, which we anticipate will be mid-June, the instructional materials amounts will be announced to districts. The instructional materials is provided to districts through EMAT. Those of you who are new to this process in Texas will get to know EMAT very, very well. EMAT is what we affectionately call our instructional materials online ordering system. Districts can spend their IMA in one of two ways, through requisitions or through disbursements. Requisitions are what they use to order the materials that are adopted through this process that we're kicking off with this webinar, the State Board of Education adoption process. They use disbursements to pay for other allowable expenses with their IMA. And speaking of other allowable expenses with their IMA, let's talk for just a minute about how they can spend those funds. These are the allowable expenditures with an IMA. These are the specifically prohibited expenditures with an IMA. But of course, this list is by no means complete because you can't list everything that you can't spend IMA funds on. But you'll see, of course, at the top of the list is instructional materials of any sort, both adopted and non-adopted. We do have a definition of instructional materials in Texas. It's in statute. That's it. You're welcome to look at it after this webinar is over, but I'm not going to spend any time reading it to you. But in addition to adopted instructional materials and non-adopted instructional materials, districts may spend their IMA on technological equipment that contributes to student learning, training in the use of the technological equipment and the instructional materials, providing access to technological equipment for instructional use. So in other words, tablets, computers, anything that students are going to use to access their instructional materials. And they can even use it for the salary or a portion of the salary of an employee who helps to make those things happen. As of maybe 2 months ago, this is how IMA spending was going in this biennium. 91% of the IMA was spent on instructional materials. 35% of the IMA was spent on requisitions. Remember, those are the ones that are adopted by the state board. And 56% on disbursements. 10% of the instructional materials fund was spent on technology. So if school districts can spend their IMA funds on both adopted and non-adopted instructional materials, Why is state adoption still important? Why is this a process that we continue to manage? It's important to districts because it helps Texas public school districts choose instructional materials knowing the extent to which they provide instruction in the required TEKS. We talked earlier about the fact that instructional materials have to be provided to students to cover 100% of their required Texas essential knowledge and skills. If districts choose adopted instructional materials, they know up front the percentage of TEKS coverage of those materials. It's also important to districts because they know that those materials are going to be available in accessible formats with no additional cost to them. We produce Braille, large print, and audio versions of state-adopted instructional materials. The district doesn't have to pay for those, we pay for it. And so districts know that those things are going to be available if they've chosen state-adopted instructional materials. They also know that state-adopted instructional materials in electronic formats have to be provided in accessible formats. So those electronic instructional materials have to be accessible to students with disabilities if they are adopted statewide. They also know that state-adopted instructional materials are going to be available at an established cost for at least 8 years. Once your products are adopted, we set up a contract with you establishing the price of your products and in any form that you want that product to be offered. In other words, in whatever kinds of bundling packages you want that product to be offered, and we contract for a specific price. That price is good for 8 years, so districts have greater financial stability when they're planning if they've chosen materials that they know aren't going to go up in price. Finally, they know that state-adopted instructional materials can be easily and conveniently ordered through EMAT. That's always going to be an option, and that is always the easiest option for districts to acquire instructional materials. Why would publishers want to have their products adopted by the state board? First of all, because districts like state board adopted products. For all the reasons that we just went over in the previous slide, districts feel confident choosing, locally adopting state adopted materials. And so that's a big selling point for them. Additionally, Additionally, some districts have actual local policies that require that they choose only state board adopted materials, assuming, of course, that we have state board adopted materials in that specific subject area. Additionally, if you go through the state review and adoption process, you benefit from the independent third-party review of your product. It's really almost kind of a crowdsource review because your product is available for everybody in the state to review and to comment on and to provide input on should you be interested in that input. You know, it's not always going to lead to anything regarding your product, but it might. And primarily you get to find out what the public thinks about your product. Also, if you've gone through the state review and had your product adopted, then you get to sell your product in EMAT. And as I said earlier, that's a great option for districts, and so it's a great option for you as well. And finally, well, of course you want to go through the adoption process because we're Texas, and so that just seems like a no-brainer. What does the adoption process involve? The adoption process involves multiple steps, which Amy is going to go through in great detail, but it always begins with TEKS adoption. The TEKS new TEKS are adopted or old TEKS are revised, and then the state board puts out a call for instructional materials called a proclamation. So that's what we're here to talk about today. And then once materials are submitted in response to the proclamation, those materials are reviewed by state review panelists for coverage of the TEKS. If they meet adoption requirements, which means they cover at least 50% of the TEKS, then they have a chance at being actually adopted by the State Board of Education. Once they are actually adopted by the State Board of Education, then we create accessible versions of those, load information about those adopted products into EMAT so that they can be distributed to districts quickly and easily. And finally, those instructional materials are implemented in the classroom. Proclamation 2019 materials will be implemented in the classroom in the 2019-20 school year, as will the revised TEKS that those materials cover. So we'll go through that again just a little more in a little more detail. The State Board issues a proclamation. The proclamation calls for new instructional materials or new information about existing instructional materials. We're going to talk more about that in just a minute. Those of you who have participated in this process but who have not been paying attention at State Board meetings may be a little confused by those words, and so like I said, we're going to go through them in great detail. Proclamations are named for the year the materials are scheduled to be available in the classroom. Each proclamation includes the subject areas and courses that are being called for, a schedule of the adoption procedures, Amy's going to go over the schedule with you, and the publisher requirements, along with instructions for providing electronic files so that we can create those accessible versions of the materials that I mentioned a few minutes ago. Publishers submit products in response to the proclamation, the call for products. State review panels review them for TEKS and English language proficiency coverage. Shelley will also talk about the ELPS when she begins in a few minutes. The public reviews them for errors, bias, quality, etc. Those of you who are new to this process should know that there will be samples of any products that you submit for a review available to the public online so that we have a very, very transparent process and the public can comment on anything that they see in those instructional materials. The SBOE, in order to give even further opportunity for that comment, holds a public hearing. Sometimes they hold two, so that people can talk to them about their views on the instructional materials under consideration. The instructional materials that are under consideration are the ones that the review panels have determined cover at least 50% of the TEKS, cover 100% of the applicable ELPS, and are free or promised to be free from factual error. They also have to comply with required manufacturing standards, or the publisher has to promise that they will do so prior to their arrival in classrooms. All instructional materials must be fully accessible to students with disabilities. I mentioned before that if the materials are state adopted, TEA provides Braille, audio, and large print versions of those materials at no cost to district. If the publisher has a product that is adopted that is includes print material, then that publisher is required by the proclamation to provide us with the appropriate electronic files in order to create those Braille, audio, and large print versions. Publishers that do not have print material but do have electronic instructional materials are responsible for the accessibility of those instructional materials. Debbie, in a few minutes, is going to talk a little bit more about the requirements to meet that accessibility standard. Proof of accessibility is required in order for the products to be made available for district order in EMAT. And finally, if districts adopt non-state adopted instructional materials, then the district is responsible for ensuring that those products are accessible, and if there's an extra cost for doing so, like making a Braille version, the district is responsible for the cost of that Braille version. The final step in the review and adoption process is local adoption. Each district has its own policy for selecting instructional materials. School boards have to select instructional materials in an open meeting. And as I mentioned earlier, schools must certify that they've adopted instructional materials and are providing instructional materials to their students that cover 100% of the TEKS. In order to do that, they have to review the materials to determine the extent to which the TEKS are covered if they're choosing non-adopted materials. Remember that they don't have to do that step if they're choosing adopted materials because that information comes with them. They also, if they're choosing non-adopted materials, have to make sure they're fully accessible. They have to order the materials directly from the publisher, and they have to pay for the materials using local funds or a disbursement. So that's kind of a big picture overview of adoption, review and adoption of instructional materials in the state of Texas. We're not going to stop and take questions at the end of each one of these slides, but I'm sure you have questions. You'll type your other questions into the question box. We'll try to answer them as we go along. And so, Carrie, I'm going to turn the microphone back over to you.
Thank you, Kelly. Just a few things to make everyone feel a little bit more comfortable as we go through so much information. Number one, this webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording once it's been completed. And also the PowerPoint will also be posted and made available to you. So sit back and relax and just know that you're going to get a second shot at all the information that's being covered. Now with that, Tammy, we're going to move on over to talk about the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, our English Language Proficiency Standards and Breakouts. And Shelly Ramos, our Senior Director of Curriculum Standards and Student Supports, will be talking to you about that. So Shelly, it's with you.
So good afternoon, everyone. As Carrie just mentioned, my name is Shelly Ramos, and I work in the Curriculum Standards and Student Support Division here at TEA. And I'm going to spend the next few minutes visiting with you a little bit about the TEKS or the TEKS, we say them both ways here at TEA, that are included in Proclamation 2019. If I can get my slides to advance, then I would be happy to talk to you about that. All right, so I want to start off with a little bit of very, very important information about the timeline for the adoption of the TEKS. So it's critical to know that as of this moment, the TEKS for English Language Arts and Reading and Spanish Language Arts and Reading are not yet final. That is a process that's ongoing with our State Board of Education. We've seen some of y'all at our SBOE meetings, so you know that this is a process that the board has been engaged in for just about 2 years now, and we do believe that it's winding down. So you can see up here on this slide that back in the very beginning of February, our State Board of Education gave preliminary approval for the TEKS for English and Spanish Language Arts and Reading for elementary and middle school. And by preliminary, that means that they've approved them for first reading and filing authorization, but they have not yet given final approval. That is not expected to happen until their April meeting, so we've got about a little over a month away for that. In the meantime, the rules have been filed with the Texas Register as part of the board's process, and we're deep in the middle of their public comment period. So the board is receiving comments from the public and from educators on a weekly basis. It's not outside the realm of possibility that the TEKS that they approved for first reading will undergo some additional amendments at their April meeting. In fact, I would say it's probably not just within the realm of possibility. It's probably a pretty good likelihood that they'll continue to amend those TEKS at their April meeting. If all goes well, on April 21st, the board will give final approval to the TEKS for elementary and middle school for both English and Spanish Language Arts and Reading. And then TEA staff will start working furiously to prepare preliminary TEKS documents for folks. That is both the rule text, showing the latest amendments. It'll also probably be some other supporting documents, and most important for you all, we'll be working on breakouts for the TEKS. And then Sometime in summer 2017, the final official rule text will be filed with the Texas Register, and then the TEKS for elementary and middle school will be adopted and implemented in classrooms beginning in the 2019-2020 school year. So that's a little bit about the timeline. So when you start asking, well, where are the final TEKS? We won't have them really until sometime in May for you. We'll have sort of draft versions for you shortly after the April SBOE meeting, but those final versions won't come until May and June. As those of you who are familiar with the TEKS for English and Spanish language arts and reading know, they're pretty extensive, and there's going to be, like I said, there's a fair amount of expectation that we'll see some additional amendments in April. So what do the TEKS for English and Spanish language arts and reading look like? How have they changed from the current TEKS? There's a few things that you'll see right off the bat if you're familiar with the current TEKS. They're going to look structurally different. And one of the reasons why they'll look structurally different is you will no longer see the infamous figure 19 linked in the TEKS. What the committees have proposed to the board is that instead the student expectation that were in what most people call figure 19, which was the reading comprehension, have been integrated into the body of the TEKS themselves. So now there's not these two separate documents that folks had to keep track of. They're all going to be incorporated into a single document, and that's going to be the same across all courses and grade levels in both English and Spanish language arts and reading. We hope that you'll see that the TEKS in the revised version that will be approved in April will be streamlined. One of the charges that the SBOE gave their TEKS review committees was to ensure that they focus on streamlining so that the content of the courses can be reasonably taught prior to the state assessment each year. You will definitely see a better alignment, a closer alignment between the TEKS for English language arts and reading for kindergarten to grade 6 and Spanish language arts and reading for kindergarten to grade 6. It was a very intentional effort on the part of the board and the committees to make sure that when possible those TEKS mirror each other, that they were developed and worked on in concert between the two different committees. For those of you who are interested in the Spanish language arts and English as a second language TEKS, I do want to draw your attention to the fact that we've got two brand new courses in this batch of rules. There is going to be two new English as a second language courses, one for grade 7 and one for grade 8. Those courses are called English Learners Language Arts, and they will be required to address all of the ELPS. And I'll talk a little bit more about the ELPS in a few moments. And then lastly, the major change, the major structural change that you'll see in the revised TEKS is that the strands have been revised substantially, if not completely. The new TEKS are organized around 7 strands. Those strands are up here on this slide, and I won't bother to read through the entire list for you. But you'll see the ones with the little arrows by them are the 7 main strands. And then some of those strands, foundational language skills, multiple genres, and composition have, for lack of a better word, they have substrands that they will be divided among. And so you'll see this as the new organization, provided that this is the final version that gets adopted next month. So I do want to spend a little bit of time visiting with you about how to find the new TEKS. Because they're not yet adopted or effective, they're a little bit tricky to find. So I apologize, and I'm going to ask for your patience, but I am going to actually walk you through this because it can be a little bit tricky. The proclamation, of course, will include links to the TEKS, but I want to make sure you are aware of how to find them in the meantime. So many of you may be familiar with our Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills webpage. That's terrific. You will see, of course, Chapter 110 contains the TEKS for English language arts and reading, and Chapter 128 is where the TEKS for Spanish language arts and English as a second language are located. You will not see the revised TEKS in those chapters. Keeping in mind, that won't happen until sometime this summer when those final rules that are adopted in April are filed with the Texas Register and they become effective. So how can you find them if they're not in the normal place? What you'll need to do, I think the best place to access them, and many of you may already be familiar with this, is through our subject area text review pages. So I'm going to ask for your patience right now as I try and navigate to that for you. So once you jump to this subject area review page, you'll see that we have each of the subject areas that the board has worked on in chronological order. So second and third in that list, you'll see English and then Spanish language arts and reading. And you'll be able to access a great wealth of information from there. And I'm going to show you actually live how to get to it. So you'll click on the subject area review. I'll start first with English language arts. And once you're on this page, this is the page where TEA staff posts all the documents related to the subject area review. So if you were to scroll all the way down to the bottom of this page, you'd be able to follow the process of the board's work on the TEKS from its beginning almost 2 years ago. You can see various iterations of the documents from committee members and from experts, all listed here. But it's in chronological order, so the most, I guess, reverse chronological order. So the most recent documents are at the very top to make it easy for you. And there's 2 documents that I want to point out to you. We also have this exact same page for Spanish language arts and reading. But the first place you want to visit is the proposed SBOE rules webpage, which I'll take you to right now. This is where we have listed the rule, we've identified and linked to the rule text that the board gave preliminary approval to at their February meeting. So if you're looking for English language arts and reading, you want to scroll down to Chapter 110, and these are in chapter order. So here you'll see Chapter 110. It's the proposed revisions for elementary and for middle school, and you can click on either one of these documents and it will open up for you a PDF of the rule text. And so this is what you're most familiar with for the TEKS. So this is a rule text version that we have available. We have the same document available there for middle school. If you're looking for the Spanish TEKS, you'd want to scroll down to the very bottom of the page. They are in Chapter 128, and we've got the same 2 sets of documents, PDF versions of the rule text. So if I refer to rule text, these are the documents that I'm referring to. We also have another handy document available for you. I'm going to jump to the Spanish language arts and reading page just to show you that we've got the same information on both pages. But you want to look just below the proposed revisions from February, and here you want to look at the vertical alignment documents. And so what staff has done is we have created documents that have all of the proposed TEKS for kindergarten through grade 12 in a single document, and they're organized by strand. So I know that the font on this is really small, but you can see that it'll go across the different grade levels. It's got the knowledge and skill statement at the top, and then you can see how that student expectation carries on across the different grade levels and courses if applicable. So both of these documents I think will be very helpful to you as you work in preparation of your products. And just wanted to make sure that you're aware of how to navigate to them, and if you have any questions, of course, we'll be able to address those for you in a bit. So we also included in this presentation have just a direct link if you want to skip out all the navigation of jumping around and visiting information on our website. Included in this PowerPoint presentation are the links to the document. So what we have as of right now are the 2 sets of documents that I just showed you. Keep in mind that those are preliminary. They've not yet been given final approval. So to add a little bit of complication to this, once the rule text is finally approved by the board, we believe that will take place in April, then you'll need to go to a different place to find those documents. The same sets of documents will likely be available, but I did want to bring your attention to the fact that it's a different web page. Those adopted TEKS will be listed under SBOE rules, adopted, not yet effective. And that's where you would be able to find them after the SBOE meeting. And I'm sure that Kelly and her great team will also be helping you out, helping you navigate to all of these different sets of documents for the TEKS for English and Spanish language arts and reading. So that's enough about where to find them. Now a little bit of information for you about what the TEKS are. And so I'm hoping that even though some of you are new to the process of instructional materials adoption in TEKSs, I suspect that you're not new to the curriculum standards in TEKSs. But I do want to go over some basic information with you about the TEKS because it'll really help understand and set some context for you as the board makes decisions in reviewing and approving your products. So the TEKS have a very simple structure. They're organized into 3 key parts. They've got every grade level or course starts with an introduction. By and large, these introductions are very similar. They talk about the different strands and sort of the philosophy behind the inclusion of the different strands. Then they have knowledge. They all have knowledge and skill statements, and of course, the most important part, what I typically refer to as the meat of the TEKS, are the student expectations. So introduction is exactly that. It's just a brief description, talks about the key content, the key concepts of the course, and it's just an overview. The information included in the introduction is not required to be taught to students. It's just helpful information about the TEKS and about the course itself. So it's really more focused at teachers and at the public. Then the knowledge and skill statements are broad statements about what students should know and be able to do in the course or the grade level. They are oftentimes organized into strands as they are in English, and we talked about the 7 different strands for English, and then the sub-strands, if you will, that some of those are divided into. And then below every knowledge and skill statement is at least one, but usually more than one student expectation. The student expectations, I said earlier, they're sort of the meat of the TEKS. They're directly related to the knowledge and skill statement that's directly above it. They are much more specific about how students demonstrate their learning. They're observable and measurable, and they always come after the phrase, the student is expected to, and that kind of explains how they get their name. So, and we refer to them as SEs very frequently, so if I start lapsing into acronyms, SEs I was just simply referring to are the student expectations. And then breakouts are not part of the TEKS themselves, but they are a way that we document the various components of every student expectation. And most of you will become very familiar with breakouts, what they are and what purpose they serve. But I just briefly wanted to mention what they are. They are the component parts of each student expectation. We do not break out knowledge and skill statements, only student expectations. And they're the tool that's used to determine if a student expectation is covered or not. And these are documents that are provided by the Texas Education Agency and will be made available to you once the final TEKS are adopted by the board and the breakouts are finalized. So all of that is a lot of talking at you, for which I apologize, but now I want to share with you an example of exactly what we were just talking about. So here you'll see a knowledge and skill statement and a student expectation from the proposed TEKS for Spanish grade 3. You'll see a couple of different pieces to this particular knowledge and skill statement. So you'll see developing and sustaining foundational language skills. That's the strand for this particular course, and it's the first strand in all of the English and Spanish language arts and reading courses. And then it's focused on listening, speaking, reading, and writing. It has a sub-strand, which is vocabulary. And then the actual knowledge and skill statement is very short. The student uses newly acquired vocabulary expressively. And then, of course, the normal end part of this, the student is expected to. Our student expectation for this particular example is the student is expected to use print or digital resources to determine meaning, syllabication, and pronunciation. So very simple. It looks pretty straightforward, but now we want to see what that looks like as a breakout. So for those of you who are not familiar yet with our breakouts, you can sort of see this is a typical format for them. We identify the knowledge and skill statement. Here you can see, for brevity, for the sake of brevity, I did not include the strand and substrand information, but you can see the knowledge and skill statement, the student expectation, and the most important part, of course, is this last column where it's broken out into the component parts. So there are 3 component parts to this particular student expectation. The student's expected to use print or digital resources to determine meaning. The student is expected to use print or digital resources to determine syllabication, and then finally to determine pronunciation. One thing I do want to point out is the difference between ors and ands. In this particular case, an or is not broken out, so the student will use either print or digital resources. They can certainly use both. So that's a great example of a very simple example, obviously, of a breakout of a student expectation. They can get much more complicated in that than this, but I thought I would start off with an easy one. So how are these breakouts used? Well, as I mentioned earlier, they're used to help the state review panels determine TEKS coverage. Kelly has already mentioned this, but I'll go over it one more time because it's important. In order for a product to be considered eligible for consideration by the board, it must address at least 50% of the total number of student expectations. So we're talking about at the SE level. And of course, it must address 100% of the applicable ELPS. So a little bit more information for you, because some of you who are new to this process may be asking yourself just this question. All student expectations within a knowledge and skill statement do not have to be addressed in order for the individual SE to be counted towards the 50%. So for example, if knowledge and skill statement 4 has 10 student expectations, we do take them at the student expectation level, not at the knowledge and skill statement level. So not all 10 of them would have to be addressed. We would be counting each individual SE. The important part to know is this second note. All breakouts within a student expectation must be sufficiently addressed in order for that SE to be counted towards the 50%. So in the example that we just looked at, all 3 of these breakouts must be addressed in the materials in order for this SE to be counted towards the 50%. If you don't cover one of them, then this student expectation would not be fully addressed. So a little bit more on TEKS coverage before I hand things over to our next presenter. In order for a citation to be considered covered, there's some things that everybody will be looking at, our board members and our state review panel. Their student expectation can only be considered addressed if it provides an opportunity for the teacher to teach, an opportunity for the student to learn, or for the student to demonstrate or practice the knowledge or skill in that particular student expectation, and that can be in either the student or the teacher material. So these are kind of 3 things. It's a little bit of a mantra that we have: opportunities for teacher to teach, for student to learn, or for the student to demonstrate or practice the student expectation. And that's how our committees will determine whether or not a particular student expectation is addressed. I promised that I would get to English language proficiency standards, and so I do want to make sure to address that, especially since we have so many new folks to the process. The ELPS are a single set. It's not like the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills where you have different sets of TEKS for every different course or grade level. There's just a single set, and it applies to all courses and all grade levels. And they outline the performance, the language proficiency descriptors for English learners in the 4 different domains: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And they must be integrated in all of the foundation curriculum subjects. And so for this particular adoption, they do have to be covered. The ELPS have to be covered 100% in the English language arts and reading TEKS for kindergarten through grade 8. And then in addition to that, they will also have to be 100% addressed in the 2 English as a second language courses, English learners language arts for grade 7 and English learners language arts for grade 8. The ELPS are English language proficiency standards, however, and so they are not required to be addressed in the Spanish language arts and reading TEKS for grades for kindergarten through grade 6. So in our English language arts courses and in the 2 ESOL courses, those are the ones where we will be looking, our committees will be looking for coverage of the ELPS. So that was a whirlwind tour of the TEKS, where to find them, and of the ELPS. And at this point, I will go ahead and hand things back to Carrie.
Thank you, Shelley. We've been watching questions as they come in, and there are lots coming in, so we do want to assure you that for everything that's not answered, we will be following up with an FAQ. And with that, Tammy, we're going to move back over to Kelly's computer, her monitor, and she's going to talk to us about Proclamation 2019. And just as the official timekeeper on this, I want to give everyone here a heads up that we are just at about, we've got about 35 minutes, so everyone watch your clock. We want to be able to get all the information covered by 4. So with that, we're handing it back to Kelly.
Thank you, Carrie. I'm going to start by addressing just a few of these questions. We got several in a row regarding my comment that the materials that are adopted must cover at least 50% of the TEKS. The most straightforward one said, why in the world would you adopt materials that cover only 50% of the TEKS? The answer is, back to Senate Bill 6, which is the bill in 2011 that created the instructional materials allotment. At the same time that the legislature was trying to give districts more freedom with their instructional materials funding, they wanted to give them more freedom with their choices of instructional materials. And so for various and sundry reasons, along with the creation of the IMA, they also put into statute that instructional materials that met 50% of the TEKS were in fact adoptable. Prior to that, it had been 100% of the TEKS. So you'll find that information in the Texas Education Code 31.023. It doesn't mean that we're necessarily looking for instructional materials that only cover 50% of the TEKS. In fact, as someone in a question pointed out, they can be adopted with 50%, but districts have to promise that they're covering all 100% of the TEKS? Yes, that is correct. So if a district were to choose a book that covered only 60% of the TEKS, then the district would need to be on its own to find something else that covered the other 40% of those TEKS. So it's a lot of percentages we throw around. If you decide to participate in this proclamation and you make it through all the way till our review and adoption summer, you'll hear us throw a lot more percentages around. We almost need some kind of visual graphic organizer in order to keep them all straight. Having explained that a book or a product is adoptable if it covers 50% of the TEKS, I want to go one step further and say that by far the vast majority of the products that are adopted in Texas cover 100% of the TEKS. I wish I had those percentages from Proclamation 2017 right in front of me, but it is a huge majority of products that are adopted that cover 100% of the TEKS. So with that, we'll move on into talking about Proclamation 2019. Carrie, thank you for the reminder about time because I will be very brief. But before I start, I want to make everybody rest easy that I have checked these slides and that is the right version of the slideshow this time. I didn't want you to worry about me. So it starts with the call. The call in Proclamation 2019, as I think Shelley mentioned, is for English Language Arts and Reading, kindergarten through 8. It's for spelling, grades 1 through 6. It's for handwriting, grades K through 5. It's for Spanish Language Arts and Reading for grades kindergarten through grade 6. And the two new courses that Shelley mentioned, English Learners Language Arts for grades 7 and 8. Additionally, there's one high school course in this call that sometimes happens, sort of a tag-along or a hitchhiker, if you will, and that's personal financial literacy. The call goes out in April, most likely, along with the final adoption of the TEKS, and it's possible that the items on this list could change at that meeting. So watch that meeting carefully to see if there are any changes to this list. The submissions, and this is the part that I need to spend a little extra time on, especially for those of you who are experienced with us, can be of multiple kinds. They can be new materials developed to align to the revised TEKS. That's the most traditional. That's what you're used to our calling for. But this time, they could also be existing materials aligned to the revised TEKS. So let's just say for a moment that you have a product that's already out in schools, either through the Texas state adoption process or through any other process. If you took that product and you correlated it to our revised TEKS, you could participate in this proclamation with that product. Your product that you submit for review and adoption does not have to be, this time, a brand new product. They could also, the submissions, be supplemental materials designed to, if combined with a currently adopted product, meet the appropriate percentage of the TEKS. So I'm going to try to say this a little more simply. In other words, you've got a currently adopted product. The revised TEKS come out. You start correlating your currently adopted product to those revised TEKS and you realize you're missing some. That there were some new standards added to the TEKS since the last adoption of English Language Arts and Reading TEKS that your product doesn't cover. You can submit a correlation document that goes with your current product and includes correlations for supplemental materials that you create to be added to your current product. So it would be kind of a package deal. A correlation, and Amy's going to talk a little bit about correlations, would include citations from both that existing product and the new material. Now you'll notice this little asterisk right here. At the last board meeting, the board directed us to add language to the proclamation that publishers that submit new products and also have currently adopted products must provide us with correlations to those currently adopted products. So let's say you're publisher Joe and you've got Rabbit Reading currently adopted, and this year you want to submit Bunny Reading. You can do that, but you must also provide us with correlations to rabbit reading to show how that product lines up to the revised TEKS. Now this is something brand new that the board has never done before. Everything on this page, on this screen, except this first bullet, is something brand new that the board has never done before. One of the, and so they're branching out in an effort to try and create more options for districts, especially in this day and age of extremely stressed funding options. So that's what they're trying to do with this requirement, or with these extra options, the options and the requirement. They are always interested in hearing your feedback about these options. And one of the points, I'm not sure we said this at the beginning of this webinar, but one of the points of this webinar is to provide an opportunity to inform you of what's going on with the proclamation so that you can give us feedback on what's in the proclamation and what kinds of concerns you may have with what's in the proclamation. So make sure that, especially on all of this new information that has never happened before, that you give us whatever helpful feedback you think you have. The action will be at the State Board of Education meeting in April. We expect this item to be on the committee of the full board, and that'll happen either Tuesday or Wednesday. Committee of the full board is the one who will probably discuss options for adding any new items to that list that we looked at on the first slide, or for making any changes to other requirements in the proclamation, and then they will vote on a recommendation. That recommendation is for the general meeting for Friday, when the State Board of Education will actually issue the proclamation, assuming, of course, everything goes according to plan. And as Shelley mentioned, the final adoption of the TEKS is expected to follow the same schedule. So now we'll just look at the adoption process in the context specifically of Proclamation 2019. In January, the January-February meeting, the SBOE discussed the proclamation, gave us some guidance about what to put in it. In March, we're conducting a publisher webinar in order to discuss the proclamation and solicit feedback from you. So that's where we are right now. In April, we expect the proclamation to be issued by the board. In June, we will publish the Proclamation 2019 questions and answers after having presented that document to the board for their approval. In September, we'll post a publisher handbook that gives you more information about all of the pieces of the proclamation, and we will also publish the State Review Panel nomination form in order to solicit nominations for people to serve on the State Review Panel. And we'll conduct another webinar like this one, only better, because we'll use all the right slides for you to help you understand the details of the proclamation requirements. In May, we'll provide all of the participating publishers with details about the summer State Review Panel meetings. In June, we will conduct those State Review Panel meetings, June and July and August, and we'll produce a preliminary report showing the TEKS coverage percentage and the ELPS coverage percentage that were determined by the State Review Panels. In September, the first of those public hearings that I mentioned earlier will occur. In October, the report of required corrections of factual errors and the list of instructional materials eligible for adoption will be posted. And in November, we expect the board to take action adopting or not adopting materials that are on that list of eligible for adoption. So that's the timeline, that's how it works, and now Amy's going to talk a little bit more about the deliverables and the details of the proclamation. Tammy, I'm going to ask you to turn our screen showing capability over to Amy, please.
Thank you, and thanks to all of you for sticking with this and spending your time with us this afternoon. I'm going to go over the different components of Proclamation 2019, and if I can get my slides to advance, there we go. We have several different components in the proclamation, and it's very important that you take time to read through and understand everything that's included. These components include the schedule of adoption procedures. There's a section titled Additional Information, Accessibility Requirements, Deliverables and Other Requirements, Student Enrollment and Standards, TEKS and ELPS, and an appendix. The schedule of adoption procedures is a list of significant dates and deadlines for everyone who participates in the review process, not just the publishers. So that includes the SBOE, TEA, publishers, state review panel members, ESCs, members of the public, and school districts. In the next several slides, I'll go over some of the most important due dates because I'm not going to cover them all. So it's crucial that you read the Schedule of Adoption Procedures section carefully and make note of all of the due dates that are relevant to you as a publisher. Kelly's already shared this slide, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I just want to point out that all of these dates that are on this timeline are a part of the Schedule of Adoption Procedures, so you would find those there. The courses that are included in Proclamation 2019 for the purposes of due dates are divided into two groups. Group A includes English Language Arts and Reading, Spelling, Handwriting, Personal Financial Literacy, and English Learners Language Arts. Group B is much smaller because it only includes the courses for Spanish Language Arts and Reading. Different due dates have been established for certain deliverables because publishers have indicated that it's often easier to develop the English materials first and then translate the Spanish materials right after. So this slide shows the due date for statements of intent to bid, and you'll notice that it's the same for both groups of courses. The statements of intent to bid are due on December 8th of this year. A statement of intent to bid is how a publisher indicates a desire to submit instructional materials for review. So this is the part in the process where you're throwing your name in the hat. You'll submit a statement of intent to bid using the EMAT system that Kelly talked about before, and I don't want anyone to stress about that because we will provide a training this fall to demonstrate to you how to do your statement of intent to bid, including the instructions on how to access EMAT. It's not uncommon following one of these webinars for us to get a series of EMAT access requests, and so I just want to emphasize that it's not necessary to do that at this point in the process. You will be required to submit a separate statement of intent to bid for every product and every course for which you intend to submit materials, but you won't submit a separate bid for the different pricing options and the different media formats you intend to offer. Your statement of intent to bid will provide very basic information about your materials, including the program title, the course or the grade level, the estimated TEKS coverage percentage, the media format, which you'll have an opportunity to say, I'm going to offer it in this media format and list out additional media formats, preliminary price, and technical requirements. But much of the information you provide at this point, you will be given the opportunity to change. In fact, everything except for one thing you can change. So you will be allowed to update your title, your TEKS coverage percentage, your media format, price, and technical requirements. The only thing that you can't update is the list of courses and grade levels that you want to submit products for. So you have to make sure that you've submitted a separate statement of intent to bid for every course and grade level that you intend to submit materials, and there aren't any exceptions made to this deadline. So it's super important that you make note of that December 8th deadline. Complete descriptions are due for both groups of courses on January 26th of 2018. Those complete descriptions will provide us with the information about the components that you plan to provide to the review panels in order to verify TEKS coverage. It won't include information about any other components other than those that you're providing for TEKS coverage. This includes the program and component titles, the unique ISBNs for the program as a whole and for each component, the number of pages and weight for all print components, and the system requirements for all digital components. You must submit a complete description for each product in each course, and unlike the statements of intent to bid, you must submit a separate complete description for every media format. Preliminary correlations are due for both groups of courses on February 23rd of 2018. Correlations in general provide us with information regarding the specific location in the materials where you believe the TEKS and the ELPS are covered, and we're going to provide you with a correlation template to use that you will fill out and return to us. By providing us with preliminary correlations, you're giving us an opportunity to review your work and provide you with feedback to make sure that you're on the right direction and doing the best job you can. You'll only need to provide a preliminary correlation for one product and course, regardless of how many products you intend to submit for review, because again, the purpose of this is just for us to give you feedback on how you're completing the correlation, and you don't even have to complete the entire correlation for the course that you choose. We just need to get enough information to thoroughly evaluate your work. This is the first time you'll actually see the different deadlines for the two groups of courses. The pre-adoption samples are due on April 6th of 2018 for courses in Group A, and on May 4th of 2018 for the courses in Group B. You must provide one complete electronic pre-adoption sample copy of the instructional materials that you are submitting for consideration. You'll give those to both TEA and each of the 20 ESCs. Any new digital program, including online programs, are required to embed the correlations to the TEKS and ELPS, which basically means that when a user clicks on the correlation from within your product, they're directed to the exact location where you believe the TEKS or ELPS are covered, and this only applies to digital products that aren't currently adopted. All samples that require a login must allow multiple and simultaneous users. And we want to point out that we're posting those access information to the samples on our website, like Kelly mentioned, to allow for public review, and that will stay up on the website until the deadline for post-adoption samples. Correlations also have different deadlines for the courses in Group A and B. The correlations for Group A are due on April 6th of 2018, and for Group B on May 4th of 2018. I already mentioned that the correlations provide information about the specific location where you believe the TEKS and ELPS are covered, and that you have to use the template that we provide. At this point, since these are your final correlations, you have to provide a correlation for every product and every course and every media format. That's not on the slide, but it is also true. The correlations are what the state review panels will use as their primary resource for determining TEKS coverage. So it is imperative to the success of your review that you make sure those correlations are carefully chosen and constructed, and that they're very clear. There are several other important dates in the schedule of adoption procedure that Kelly's already gone over, so again, I'm not going to spend time talking about it. I just wanted to point out that they are listed in the schedule of adoption procedure. The additional information section will provide you with guidance and statutory citations regarding the adoption process and conditions for adoption. The next section, which Debbie's going to talk about, outlines the accessibility requirements. There are accessibility requirements for publishers of both print and electronic materials, and you have to meet those requirements to ensure that the materials are accessible to students with disabilities. Meeting these requirements is a condition of adoption, and it's very important that you fully understand these requirements early on in the process, because it's way easier to develop your product with these requirements in mind than it is to bring a completed product into compliance after the fact. In the deliverables and other requirements section, you'll find more detailed information about publisher requirements and the deliverables that are listed in the Schedule of Adoption Procedures. You can also find the statutory citations associated with those deliverables and requirements in this section. The items in this section are organized in the order in which they are due. I know if you, at first glance, it might look strange because they're not in alphabetical order, but that's why they're in chronological order. The student enrollment section provides the enrollment numbers based on the information currently available in PEIMS for the 2015-16 school year. But some of the courses included in Proclamation 2019 are brand new, so there will not be enrollment information listed for those courses. We will be updating this section with the enrollment numbers for the 2016-17 school year once that information is available, just so that it's a little more current. The next section provides links to the TEKS and the ELPS. As Shelley mentioned, the links to the TEKS right now direct you to the current standards, not the new revised standards that your instructional materials must cover. So we will update the proclamation with the links to the new TEKS this summer as soon as those are available. Instructional materials must cover at least 50% of the TEKS. I know that we've all said that, but we just want to make sure that you understand that they must cover at least 50% to be eligible for adoption. The ELPS are not undergoing any revisions, so the link provided to the ELPS in the proclamation is the most up-to-date information and the information you should use. Instructional materials must cover 100% of the applicable ELPS in order to be eligible for adoption. And ELPS coverage is required in every course that's included in this proclamation except for those in Spanish language arts and reading. The appendix contains a list of resources for general accessibility, designing accessible websites, closed captioning and audio description. And there's also a glossary that defines many of the terms that we use throughout the proclamation. We will answer some of the questions you've been sending in at the end of the webinar, and we'll also post a Q&A when we post our presentations. But if you still have unanswered questions about the proclamation or the review and adoption process, please don't hesitate to contact the review and adoption staff at the email address or phone number listed on your screen. And Carrie, I think we're ready for the next presenter.
Okay, thank you, Amy. And with that, Tammy, we're going to move over to Debbie's screen. And for a few moments, Debbie Gonzalez, our accessibility coordinator, is going to talk to you about accessibility requirements. For the remainder of the agenda, Debbie, just giving you a heads up, we have about 10 minutes left, and we do need to leave room too for next steps and questions. So you have a special challenge.
Thanks, Carrie. Good afternoon. I'd like to tell you about some of the accessibility requirements for your products. The information I'm going to share can also be found under accessibility requirements and accessibility resources in the proclamation. School districts are required to provide accessible versions of instructional materials to students who are blind or otherwise unable to use printed materials under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. As Kelly said, these state-adopted accessible instructional materials are provided at no cost to eligible students. Sorry about that. And when we talk about accessible materials, I do want to make the point that you've heard a lot about TEKS-bearing or text-bearing content, but when we talk about accessible materials, we mean all of the materials, not just something that is going to have the TEKS or the text in them. So the requirements for print products, I'm going to talk about first, and then I'll go over the requirements for electronic products. Publishers of adopted print materials must provide NIMAS files of their programs to facilitate the production of specialized formats. NIMAS is the technical standard used to produce the file from which the accessible, student-ready, alternate format versions of instructional materials can be created for those students with print disabilities. These files will be required of all printed instructional materials, the IMAS files. The technical specifications can be found at the Accessible Educational Materials website, or http://aem.cast.org. You select Creating AEM, and then National Instructional Materials Accessibility Standards, NIMAS, and finally NIMAS Technical Specifications versions 1.1. If you're a new publisher, you will need to request a publisher account from the National Instructional Materials Access Center or the NIMAC at aph.org. The NIMAC will provide any information or instructions that you need, and they're really, really very nice. You'll also need to provide the contact information for your production manager and the individual who will provide the NIMAS files when you provide your other contact information to TEA. Please make sure that you pay attention to the dates that the NIMAS files are required. Producers of specialized formats cannot begin the process until the NIMAS files are received. So our Braille producers can't start to Braille something until they receive those files. The National Center on Accessible Educational Materials is a really good resource. Just go to Creating AEM, and you'll find all kinds of really wonderful information there, and they'll answer a lot of your questions. The NIMAC actually has a completely redesigned website that went live yesterday. So they've made it so it's extremely easy to use. Now, there are some requirements for publishers using electronic materials or providing electronic materials. Publishers that have electronic instructional materials adopted by the State Board of Education must contract with a reputable third party to provide a report for each electronic component. This report must verify that the components follow the Web Content Accessibility or WCAG 2.0 AA standards and technical standards required by Section 508 of the Federal Rehabilitation Act. And Section 508 here is their website, and then the Web Accessibility Guidelines, the WCAG. And finally, if you have any questions, please contact me or the division at 512-463-9601. And I'll turn it over to Carrie again.
Okay, Debbie, thank you. Well done. And with that, Tammy, we're moving back to Amy's screen for her to go through a quick little checklist for us.
Okay, the pressure. I know we have 5 minutes, so I'm going to try to get through as much as I can.
Amy?
Yes?
Amy, this is Kelly. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just checked with Tammy, and she says we will not be blown off the air if we don't end right at 4. So we can breathe over a little bit, and maybe that'll make you breathe a little more easily.
Good, thank you. Okay, so I know we've covered a heck of a lot of information, and I just want to bring us back to what should you do next. And my suggestions first are to review the law related to instructional materials, which is in the Texas Education Code, Chapter 31. You should also review the rules that pertain to instructional materials in Chapter 66 of the Texas Administrative Code, and read the proclamation in its entirety. You should also spend some time exploring the TEA website and sign up for the Review and Adoption listserv. So I'm going to try to do what Shelley did and walk you through how to do those things. So first, when you're on the TEA website, which you can see the address at the top of the screen there, tea.texas.gov, if you hover your mouse over this little book that says Academics, you'll see this pop-up menu, and then you come down here to Instructional Materials, and that'll take you to the main instructional materials page. And on this page, you definitely want to pay attention to the latest news section. We try to post anything that's really important on this latest news as well as in the page where it really lives. You also can scroll down here to general information and join our listservs. And so you'll see right there, you put your email or text option and then the appropriate email address or phone number. Once you hit submit, you'll be taken to a page where you can select the review and adoption listserv as well as any other listservs that TEA manages that you want to subscribe to. To access the proclamation page over here on the right-hand side, you'll see these quick links and you can click on the word proclamations. And here we have information about proclamations, including the draft version of Proclamation 2019. You can also access information about the review and adoption process, which is what we've been spending a lot of our day talking about today. And you'll see here that it just goes through the process chronologically. And at the end of this page, there are links to Chapter 31 and Chapter 66, as well as the current version of the adoption cycle. But I want to put a little asterisk there and say that that is always changing, as the board makes decisions. You can also visit the publisher portal, which is what I really want to spend some time talking about. It hasn't been updated to include a lot of information about Proclamation 2019 because we're still early in the process, but if we scroll down here and look at Proclamation 2018 as an example, you'll see that on this page we're going to put all of the important deadlines related to publishers here on this page, and we also put links to forms when you're actually submitting a form rather than submitting information through EMAT. So you constantly want to be checking back at the publisher portal to see if we've added any additional information. The general structure is that we'll also have the proclamation document itself, the contact information for your service centers, and then we'll have a list of helpful documents. So this is where we'll be posting this publisher meeting. That'll go way up here at the top under helpful documents, which just doesn't exist yet for Proclamation 2019. Let's see here. Going back to your next steps, you should definitely watch the live or the archived SBOE meetings in April and June because Proclamation 2019 items will be discussed at those meetings. And going back to the website, if you hover over About TEA and then scroll down under Leadership and select State Board of Education, you can, from here, look at the current agenda. So once the agenda has been finalized, these will become live links and you can click on it to get to the agenda items for that day. And you can also access live and archived broadcasts by clicking on this link here. And if we were having a meeting right now, there would be something to click on here, but you can access past meetings. So if you weren't able to listen live and you want to go back and listen to something that has already happened, you can click on past meetings and you'll see here that you could watch the board meeting. And I'm not going to actually watch it, but you could do that. Finally, if after this process you decide that you want to participate, or after listening to all of this you decide you want to participate, you would need to mark your calendar for the Statement of Intent to Bid due date. Remember, that's the due date that you can't miss if you want to participate, and that's December 8th of this year. Oh, I did not turn off my Skype, I'm sorry. Okay, so I think, Carrie, we're ready for Kelly.
All right, thank you, Amy. Thank you, Amy. And with that, Tammy, we're going to hand it back to Kelly for...
No, actually we're not.
Okay.
Because Amy has these slides.
Okay.
So just keep it on Amy. Basically, we just built in time here for some actual question answering, except of course we didn't build it in very well, since we are now 1 minute over the time that we said we'd end. In order to try and be as polite to all of you as possible, I'm not going to take any time to answer these questions, but I will say that, because I don't want those of you who plan to be somewhere else at 4 to miss that part, but I will say that we've had some excellent questions come in. I've been watching them, and they've made me realize that we clearly should have planned more time for this today, and so I want to apologize that we didn't. And we should have covered some topics that we didn't cover because some of you are ready to jump right in. You're not interested in preliminary information. You're ready to jump right into the meat. So based on that, I'm thinking that it may be possible that we have another webinar earlier than the one that we currently have planned for later in the process. And so we'll look at your questions, we'll look at our calendars, we'll think about whether another webinar after the proclamation is issued, but earlier than I indicated in the previous set of slides, in order to give you really good answers to all of these really good questions. We will also be publishing answers to all of your questions, and it'll take us a few days to get that done, so don't expect it to be done tomorrow or this afternoon, but we'll work on that and try to get those up as quickly as possible. We may even try to do that in the form of a slideshow in order, if we think that that's going to be more user-friendly. So all of that said, look forward to hearing more from us, especially answers to those awesome questions that you guys have submitted. Thank you very much. If you think of additional questions after this webinar ends, send them to review.adoption@tea.texas.gov. You can always, of course, also pick up the phone and call us. And finally, I just want to say thank you so much for your participation here today. We appreciate your attendance. We appreciate your good questions. We appreciate your interest in the State Board of Education adoption process. And we appreciate your forgiveness when our presentations don't go as smoothly as we'd like them to. You guys have a great afternoon.